Welcome to week 7 of the third term of Anatomy and Physiology, where we'll be looking at chapter 26 and the study of fluids, electrolytes, and acid-base balance. In some regards, this is simply an expansion of last chapter's study of the urinary system, but it also combines other concepts we've considered earlier in A&P, including aspects of the endocrine system as well as the respiratory system. In this chapter, we're going to begin by looking at the functions of water in the body. And from there, we're going to move on to look at water content in the body by considering the two primary fluid compartments where fluids can be found, the intracellular and extracellular fluid spaces or compartments. We'll study the extracellular fluid compartment in even more detail as it's further subdivided into blood plasma and interstitial fluid. In addition, we're going to consider the regulation of fluid intake and output, specifically how do we obtain our daily water needs and what cues do we respond to for the intake of water, as well as what ways we lose water and how our body regulates water loss or helps prevent water loss. Moving on, we'll consider the regulation of three major electrolytes in our body, that of sodium, potassium, and calcium. Specifically, we're going to consider what hormones regulate these three ions and why that regulation is important. Finally, we're going to revisit a topic from the first term of Anatomy and Physiology by discussing the bicarbonate buffering system. And I'd like you to understand this buffering system from the manner I present in lecture, not the textbook. So please consider this closely here as you study the bicarbonate buffering system, not only the equation itself, but also then we're going to look at the terms respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, as well as metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, and what medical conditions lead to the development of those conditions in terms of the bicarbonate buffering system, as well as help from the lungs and of the kidneys. As we consider water in the body, I first want to talk about the major functions of water, for which I have listed 6. First, water, given its polar nature, acts as a solvent. For instance, the polar nature of water molecules can help form hydrogen bonds with other polar substances, ensuring that those substances dissolve in fluids like blood, where they can then be transported throughout the body. And in this manner, we can move essential nutrients like glucose, amino acids, vitamins, minerals throughout the body where they're needed and can be used for energy, for growth, and for repair. We can also consider water as a solvent. As we look at the formation of urine, which is composed primarily of water. And we have dissolved waste products like urea and uric acid excreted from the body with the help of our urine. Further, many enzymes require an aqueous environment to function properly. And in this manner, water allows enzymes to interact with substrates in order to catalyze biochemical reactions. So we're using water as a solvent there. And finally, as a solvent, water dissolves electrolytes like sodium, like potassium, like calcium, which aid in things like nerve impulse transmission, muscle contraction, as well as fluid balance in the body. Point number 2, water acts as a transport vehicle, essential in the circulatory system, where we see it carrying oxygen, nutrients, hormones, enzymes, blood elements like red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and other proteins throughout the body. It also helps remove waste products from the tissues, delivering them to various points of the body where they're going to be processed before being excreted. Our third point, water helps with temperature regulation. Water can absorb a lot of heat before its own temperature rises significantly, which means water can absorb and store heat without experiencing rapid temperature changes in the body. And in this manner, water helps absorb and dissipate heat that's been produced by exothermic or heat generating reactions, such as cell respiration. Water also helps with temperature regulation through sweat release, and as the body temperature rises, sweat glands release fluid onto the skin surface, and as sweat evaporates, it helps cool the body. Water can help with lubrication, where it might help reduce friction at synovial joints. Think of synovial fluid composed of water and hyaluronic acid. And it can serve in other ways, such as with the production of saliva, which helps in moistening food and forming a bolus, which will ultimately go on to be swallowed. It can also help aid in the mixing of enzymes, such as salivary amylase and salivary lipase, which begin the breakdown of foodstuff, the chemical breakdown of foodstuff in the mouth before even moving on to further areas of the digestive tract. Finally, as it pertains to lubrication, we can discuss the production of mucus, a slippery secretion produced by mucous membranes lining different parts of the body. So that may mean our respiratory, digestive, our reproductive tracts. And we're going to see that mucus consists of water, of mucins, and of immunological proteins. And so with this in mind, water serves as a protective barrier of sorts against microbes in the respiratory system, or it might help ease movement of food stuff in the digestive system. Both of those are functions of mucus, as well as it helps protect the digestive lining from damage, especially damage to enzymes and low pH solutions, which might otherwise cause damage to the digestive tract. Water aids in hydrolysis reactions. Now, I can think of two examples for this. We can have ATP hydrolysis, where the hydrolysis of adenosine triphosphate releases energy, which can be used for cell activities. Further, we can talk about catabolic processes. Hydrolysis reactions lead to the breakdown of macromolecules into simpler substances. And for example, proteins are broken down into individual amino acids. Carbohydrates are broken down into simple sugars, and lipids, through this hydrolysis reaction, can be broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. So we're taking macromolecules and breaking them down into monomers, and that is a hydrolysis reaction. Finally, water is involved in the body's buffering system, helping to maintain the pH balance in the body. And specifically, we're going to look at the bicarbonate buffering system at the end of this lecture, which relies on water to help neutralize excess acids or bases. And again, we're going to see that at the end of today's lecture. Water is a critical component in the human body, playing a role in many physiological processes where it constitutes a significant portion of the body's composition. Now, saying that, total body water is partly determined based on things like age, body mass, sex, and relative body fat. And so with this in mind, let's go ahead and talk about some of these differences. First, we can talk about ages. Babies have a higher body water content than adults, and their body composition is different with more lean tissue as compared to adults. And due to the fact that rapid growth in these early stages of life require a watery medium for the biochemical reactions that are taking place, as well as the transport of nutrients needed for growth, we do see a higher body content of water. Newborns are reported to have somewhere between 75 to 80% water content by body weight, with drops over time such that by about 1 year, infants have a 60 to 70% water content by body weight. In contrast, we can look at healthy or lean adults. We're going to see that body fluids constitute somewhere between maybe 50 to 60% of total body mass given female or male bodies. And on average, women have a lower water content than men, given a higher proportion of body fat found in females, which holds less fluid than other tissues in the body. And then it's necessary to point out, as we age, water content declines. We might see a drop in kidney function due to the gradual and very natural changes or loss of nephrons and a decrease in filtering capacity, as well as a decrease in blood flow. We also might see changes in hormone production. As we age, ADH is impacted. We might also see renin, the enzyme renin, that's impacted. Elderly also experience a general loss in the sensation of thirst as a result of the hypothalamus's diminished ability to detect hydration status. And then added to this, we can also think about muscle mass, which diminishes in age, which will reduce water content even further. We can go ahead and calculate body water content. And for the average healthy adult of normal weight, calculating total amount of water in the body can be done by following these 3 steps. First of all, we need to determine body weight in kilograms. So we can actually go ahead and convert pounds to kilograms as needed. So if we have a 150-pound individual, we can say that we have 0.453592237 kilograms per 1 pound. Now, with a bit of calculation, we get 68 kilograms. I've rounded that. It was actually 68.04 kilograms, but we're going to round to 68 kilograms. So now what we can do is, depending on age, so choose a percent based on age. Let's assume a healthy adult female, by which we have about 50% water making up body mass. So we can now take that 58 kilograms and we can say percent water is going to be 0.50 for percent. And that's going to give us 34 kilograms of water. Now, convert kilograms of water to liters of water. This is just a very easy conversion. We have 34 kilograms, and now we have 1 liter. We have approximately 34 liters of water for a healthy adult female, assuming the standard 50% water per body mass. As we look at body water content, there are two major compartments in the body where fluids are held. We have what's called an intracellular fluid compartment, that is, the fluid held within the cells, making up about 2/3 of total body fluid. And we also have an extracellular fluid compartment, by which fluid is found outside cells and make up about 1/3 of our total body fluids. Now, of the fluids found outside our cells of the body, that 33% or 1/3 of total body volume, we actually see about 20% of that, of the extracellular fluid, being blood plasma, the liquid portion of blood, and about 80% of our extracellular fluid is composed of interstitial fluid, the fluid occupying the microscopic spaces found between tissue cells. Now, extracellular fluid can also comprise things like our lymphatic fluid found in lymphatic vessels, cerebral spinal fluid found in the nervous system, synovial fluid of our joints, aqueous humor and vitreous body of the eyes, and the fluid between our serous membranes, the pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal membranes, as well as endolymph and paralymph within our inner ears. Water makes up a significant portion of our body, and it's often referred to as a universal solvent due to its unique ability to dissolve a very wide variety or a wide range of solutes that could be liquids, solid, or gases in order to create some kind of solution. In part, this is due to the polarity of water molecules. Remember, we see a partial positive charge or a delta positive charge associated with hydrogen atoms and a partial negative charge or the delta negative charge with our oxygen atoms. Electrons spend more time surrounding oxygen as they do surrounding hydrogen, and that gives us these partial positive and partial negative charges, creating a polar molecule. And then when a solute is added to water, the polar water molecules are going to surround the solute particles, separating and dispersing the solute molecules into solution. Now, we can also discuss the solutes themselves. Solutes may be classified as either electrolytes or non-electrolytes. Electrolytes are substances, typically inorganic compounds, that is, not composed of carbon, that dissociate into ions when dissolved in solution. And they can conduct an electrical current, essential for various physiological functions. At this moment, think nerves and muscles. And they further help regulate fluid balance within and between cells. Some examples of ions from solutes we've seen include sodium and potassium, as well as calcium and magnesium. Now, in contrast, non-electrolytes are substances that don't separate into ions when put into solution. They remain intact, usually because they're bound by covalent bonds, and as a result, no electrical current is generated. Two examples include glucose and urea, molecules classified as non-electrolytes. Let's now look at the presence or the absence of electrolytes in the two fluid compartments of our body. That is, we're talking about extracellular fluid, so the extracellular fluid space, which is abbreviated as ECF, and our intracellular fluid space, which is abbreviated ICF. And we see that the electrolyte content of the extracellular fluid space and the intracellular fluid space differ considerably. Within the extracellular space, looking at the electrolyte content here, so things found outside cells, sodium is the major cation found here. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Recall back from the first term of anatomy and physiology and our study of muscle physiology, as well as the second term of A&PIII, where we studied nerve transmission. We saw sodium ions flood into a cell in order to meet threshold and generate an action potential. And as we look at negatively charged ions found in the extracellular fluid, so sodium is our positively charged ion, or a major cation. Our major anion found in the extracellular fluid is chloride. Chloride is going to help balance the positive charge of sodium to ensure electrochemical neutrality. We can also look at our intracellular fluids now. And in contrast to extracellular fluids, or the ECF, looking at electrolyte contents within the intracellular fluid found inside the cell, it makes sense that potassium is the major cation found here. As we saw potassium leave the intracellular space during repolarization of skeletal muscle cells and nervous tissue, whereby then potassium was pumped back in and exchanged for sodiums in order to achieve a polarized state. So thinking back to the study of the nervous system and our skeletal muscular system, we're seeing sodium and potassium come back into play. As we look at negatively charged ions found within the intracellular fluid, hydrogen phosphate is the primary anion found inside the cell, where it serves as an intracellular buffer, helping neutralize acids and bases, as well as it helps maintain a stable pH in the intracellular environment. Further, hydrogen phosphate acts as a storage for phosphate groups needed in the production of ATP from ADP. And remember, we're contributing a phosphate group to create ATP from ADP. We also see phosphate needed in nucleotides of nucleic acids. Think about the phosphate group as one of the three parts of the nucleotide structure, with the other two being a ribose sugar and a base. And think of the composition of the cell membrane. Think of phosphate heads, our polar heads that are associated with a phospholipid. This slide gives a visual of the position of important ions, and specifically, it goes a step further than the discussion we had with our last slide. Recall we have the intracellular space and the extracellular space, with the extracellular space further subdivided into interstitial fluid and blood plasma. Now, looking at this graph right here, what we're going to see is a concentration of a certain ion on the x-axis. Then we're going to see the total solute concentration on the y-axis. Then we're going to see a couple of different colors, red, blue, and yellow. Red and blue represent our extracellular fluid, by which red is going to be blood plasma, and our interstitial fluid is here in blue. Our yellow, so we have these yellow bars here, represent intracellular fluid. Now, what do we see here? We are going to see, as we consider let's look at intracellular fluid first. We know that potassium hangs out in the intracellular space. And if we look here, potassium, here we go. We see that it has a very, very high concentration. In contrast, we can look at sodium, which we should recognize from prior studies should be higher in the extracellular space. And in fact, that's what we're going to find. We find high concentration in blood plasma as well as the interstitial fluid. Chloride is going to be the same way. Now, we talked about our hydrogen phosphate found in the intracellular fluid, and we do see that as a high concentration here, very, very low concentration of hydrogen phosphate in the blood plasma or the interstitial fluid. So this gives you a good example of the ion composition of various body fluids in the two major compartments. That is the extracellular space and the intracellular space. This slide, I want to recap some of the major learning points up through now. You should be able to answer these 5 questions. I want you to know the major ions found in the extracellular space as well as the intracellular space. And I want you to know the 2 major types of extracellular fluid, blood plasma and interstitial fluid, and what do we have more of. You should know the major cations of the extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid, and then you should be able to recall the 2 major cations, sodium and potassium, which are kept in their respective body compartments. Think about the sodium-potassium ATPase pump we used from our study of muscle physiology and nerve transmission as we reversed the locations by which sodium and potassium are found during the process of repolarization. I'd like to introduce you to a new term, osmolality, something you might have learned about in a chemistry class. And in the context of the human body, osmolality specifically refers to the concentration of solutes or solute particles in a body fluid, which might include blood plasma and interstitial fluid, both being extracellular fluids, as well as the fluid found within cells or the intracellular fluid. The body maintains osmolality within a very narrow range in order to ensure proper physiological function, with the kidneys playing a primary role in the regulating of osmolality by adjusting the concentration of urine and either reabsorbing electrolytes or secreting excess electrolytes out into the filtrate. Further, antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, which is released by the posterior pituitary gland in response to increased plasma osmolality, helps increase water reabsorption at the site of the kidneys, thereby helping dilute blood plasma and extracellular fluid and lowering osmolality. So we see these fluid shifts in relationship to our solutes as well as the fluid found in our body. And we can measure that number of dissolved solutes or particles in a fluid by looking at osmolality. Now, cells neither shrink nor swell because intracellular and interstitial fluids have the same osmolality or concentration of solutes or solute particles in a solution. And changes in fluid composition within these spaces, they may result in fluid imbalances. Specifically, we might see an increase in the concentration of solutes in the interstitial fluid, such as sodium, that draws water out of cells, shrinking cells slightly, whereas a decrease in the concentration of solutes in the interstitial fluid will cause cells to swell. Other things that might impact osmolality or throw off balance include metabolic products like glucose and urea, as well as the hydration status, which can also alter osmolality. Dehydration, or conversely, excessive fluid intake. Now, dehydration increases osmolality, whereas overhydration reduces or dilutes osmolality. And some rules to keep in mind: an increase in solutes in a fluid or a decrease in fluid results in an increase in osmolality, whereas a decrease in solutes in fluid or an increase in fluid will lead to a decrease in osmolality. So keep these two facts in mind, or rules in mind, moving forward. When we consider the movement of fluid between two major compartments, we find that both osmotic and hydrostatic pressures regulate the exchange of fluids. So now we're going way back to bulk flow, or the ideas, some of the terminology with bulk flow from chapter 19, as well as a bit of chapter 20. When we look at water, water moves freely along its osmotic gradient, that is, from a high water content to low water content. And in contrast, solutes will want to do the same thing. They want to diffuse from high concentration of solutes to an area of low concentration of solutes. However, there are some limitations to this. Solutes are restricted based on three things. We can talk about electrical charge, or we can talk about their size, or their need for a carrier protein to move a solute from one side of a cell membrane to another. And so specifically, as we talk about the size of a solute, smaller solutes pass through membranes more easily, whereas larger solutes require specialized transport mechanisms. And as it pertains to electrical charge, charged solutes interact with the cell membrane and transport proteins based on their electrochemical gradients and the membrane potential. And finally, as it pertains to the need for transport proteins, solutes that can't diffuse directly through the lipid bilayer, maybe they're too big, they might require transport proteins for facilitated or active transport. Lastly, I want to make a special note. As we look at this slide, and as we've looked at the last two slides before this one, you should walk away with a general understanding that a change in solute concentration in any compartment, that is the extracellular compartment or the intracellular compartment, leads to water movement. We see an adjustment to osmolality to ensure equal osmolality on either side of a membrane, either with the help of water movement or potentially with solute movements. Now, we've established that fluids move between compartments, but how does this take place? There are two major ways by which fluids move between compartments. They may move between blood plasma and interstitial fluid, as well as we may see an exchange of fluids between the interstitial fluid and the intracellular fluid, that is, movement across a cell membrane. I'd like to discuss each of these two methods of fluid in a little more detail. And first, I want to discuss the exchange of fluid between blood plasma and interstitial fluid. And we've looked at this earlier in this school year. In chapter 20, in our study of the lymphatic system, with lymphatic fluid created as a result of fluids moving out across the capillary walls to the interstitial space. Recall we have a single layer of endothelial cells that line and create a permeable barrier making up capillary walls, so separating blood plasma from interstitial space. We have hydrostatic pressure, so pressure against the capillary walls, which was the primary driver of movement out of capillaries. So blood pressure was assisting with that. And then we had colloid osmotic pressure of the capillaries, or osmotic pressure exerted by proteins found in blood plasma, most of which proteins were albumin. And that pulled fluid back into the capillaries at the venous end of our capillary beds. And this transport process, we saw, allowed fluids, which were rich in oxygen and nutrients, to bathe the cells and the tissues, and at the same time, it allowed for the pickup of wastes and carbon dioxide produced at the tissue level to be picked up and returned back into circulation to be distributed where it needed to be in order to be removed from the body as waste. In contrast, we also see movement between the interstitial fluid and the intracellular fluid, or exchange of fluid between these two. And so in this case, we're looking at fluid movement from one compartment to another, that is from the extracellular to the intracellular spaces or vice versa. And this exchange of fluid helps ensure proper cell function within a cell, things like metabolism, protein synthesis, enzymatic reactions, and it also ensures cells receive nutrients and acquire gases, dispose of waste products, remove carbon dioxide following cell respiration. The interstitial fluid serves as a conduit for the exchange of all these things, for the exchange of nutrients, gases, wastes, as was established in the movement of fluids via blood plasma and the interstitial fluid from this first example up here when we were considering blood plasma and the interstitial fluid. This also here is going to serve as a pathway for water to move across the cell membrane via osmosis. When we consider body homeostasis, we need to ensure the required amounts of water are present in the various compartments of the body. And so how do we access water? Well, most of our water ingestion is through fluids and the foods we consume. And to a small extent, we obtain some water by metabolic processes, such as water produced in cell respiration, as well as the water produced through dehydration synthesis reactions we undergo during anabolic reactions. Daily water loss is going to equate approximately 2,500 milliliters, which we'll look at in the next slide. And as a result, we need to ingest or otherwise produce 2,500 milliliters of water per day as well. And so to do this, we tend to ingest somewhere around 1,600 milliliters of fluid, in addition to consuming moist foods of about 700 milliliters. And the remaining 200 milliliters is obtained as metabolic water, or produced in the body, mainly when electrons are accepted by oxygen during aerobic cell respiration, and to a very small extent, again, through that process of dehydration synthesis reactions. Now, when considering water output, there are some terms I want you to understand as we look at this part of the slide here. First, we have obligatory water loss, or the minimal amount of fluid loss from the body that can occur, sometimes defined as unavoidable loss of water. Obligatory water loss is said to be either sensible or insensible. As we talk about sensible obligatory water loss, we're talking about the loss that can be perceived by the senses and can be measured. If you've lost it, you know you've lost it. And so we can consider this primarily via urine. But we also have insensible water loss, which can't be perceived or measured directly. You've lost it, but you can't perceive it, or maybe you can't measure it. You've lost it, but you don't know you lost it. And of course, you don't know how much you've lost. And so this might come from the respiratory system, from the skin, and from water excreted from our stool. To balance water, recall antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, from our study of Chapter 16 and the endocrine system. ADH, sometimes referred to as vasopressin, is produced by the hypothalamus. It's released into circulation by way of the posterior pituitary gland. And recall that when stimulated by an increase in water loss, ADH promotes the insertion of things called aquaporins, or these special water channel proteins, into the apical membrane of the principal cells of our collecting ducts found in the kidneys. And that's going to result in an increase in permeability of those cells to water, resulting in the reabsorption of water. So we're taking more water from filtrate, making a more concentrated urine. And this leads to an increase in blood volume in the body, which in turn results in an increase in blood pressure. So here we have two scenarios, scenario 1 and scenario 2. With an increase in water loss, the hypothalamus detects this and it stimulates thirst, but it also leads to the insertion of aquaporins, increasing water absorption. Now in scenario 2, with an increase in water retention, the hypothalamus detects that as well, blocking the release of ADH, leading to the production of a more dilute urine, resulting in the loss of excess water by urine, and that's going to lead to a drop in blood volume and a drop in blood pressure. Now, as it pertains to water balance, there are some abnormalities in water balance to discuss. And I want to discuss 3 topics. I want to discuss dehydration, hypotonic hydration, and edema. These are abnormalities of water balance. And first we have dehydration. Dehydration occurs when there is some significant loss of water from the body, leading to a deficit in total body water content. And this might be due to common things like profuse sweating, of diarrhea or vomiting, or of water deprivation. However, dehydration might also result from endocrine disturbances such as diabetes mellitus or diabetes insipidus, maybe from medical emergencies like a hemorrhage or severe burn, or from abuse using diuretics. Symptoms of dehydration include thirst, dry mouth. We see a reduced urine output, with the scientific term for that being oliguria. We might see dark-colored urine, either dark yellow or amber in nature, and sometimes we might see a patient experiencing dizziness or fatigue, oftentimes because of electrolyte imbalances, or maybe it's just a decreased blood volume resulting in a decrease in blood pressure, and we can't perfuse our organs well enough. No matter, in all of these cases, rehydration with oral rehydration therapy or IV fluids should be coordinated with treatment of the underlying cause as necessary. Next, we have hypotonic hydration. Simply put, this is overhydration, and sometimes it's called water intoxication. And in this manner, there's an excess intake of water relative to the body's ability to excrete it, leading to the dilution of electrolytes in the blood, which may sometimes be seen in athletes following extreme physical activities, such as after a marathon run. And it may also be caused as a result of excess release of ADH, leading to water retention, or from kidney dysfunction, where kidneys just don't have the ability to excrete excess water. Now, the major effect of hypotonic hydration is hyponatremia, or just simply put, low sodium levels, as a result of excessive water intake, diluting sodium concentration in the blood. Further, it might cause swelling of cells due to water entering the cells to areas of higher osmolality. The symptoms of overhydration might include headache, potentially indicating cerebral edema or swelling of brain tissue. We might see mental disturbances or confusion, nausea, vomiting, and sometimes muscle cramping. Treatment might include fluid restriction to prevent further dilution of sodium, or the administration of a hypertonic solution to correct sodium levels. Now, it clearly also requires treatment of the underlying condition, if not as a result of excess water intake. So that should be put into place as well. Finally, we look at edema, or the accumulation of excess fluid in the interstitial spaces, or sometimes within the body cavities, which leads to swelling. Edema is often the result of an imbalance in the forces, that is, either the capillary hydrostatic pressure or capillary osmotic pressure, that regulates fluid between capillaries and interstitial space. Ultimately, under some conditions, too much fluid is pushed out of the capillary beds, not enough is brought back in, or we might see other conditions like hypoproteinemia, that is a drop in protein in the blood, where then at the venous end of capillary beds, we don't see the attraction of fluids to those negatively charged proteins found in blood. Now, we might also see too little fluid returned to the capillary beds as a result of extravasation, which are proteins that have leaked out from the capillaries into the interstitial fluid space due to things like inflammation. And that is going to attract fluids. So we see fluids attracted to the negatively charged proteins outside of the capillary beds. For a moment, I want to turn our attention back to electrolytes and the purpose of electrolytes in body fluids. Recall ions form when electrolytes dissolve or dissociate in fluid, and as they do so, they may serve four general functions in the body. First, because ions are largely confined to particular fluid compartments, certain ions control movement of fluids by osmosis between fluid compartments. And think about sodium in this example. Where sodium goes, water follows. Other electrolytes include potassium and chloride, which also help regulate the distribution of water throughout the body's compartments. Next, ions might help maintain the acid-base balance required for normal cell function and metabolic processes. Specifically, bicarbonate is an important ion that acts as a buffer to neutralize excess acid in the body, helping maintain a pH somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45 in the blood. And we looked at the bicarbonate buffering system early in the school year. We're going to consider it coming up shortly in this lecture. Further, some ions naturally carry an electrical current in the body, which is responsible for supporting nerve and muscle function. And so that's going to allow for the production of action potentials and graded potentials, as well as in some cases, the secretion of some hormones and neurotransmitters. Finally, some ions might serve as enzyme cofactors, or compounds needed to facilitate cell function and metabolic processes. In particular, magnesium acts as a cofactor for various enzymatic reactions involved in DNA replication, in protein synthesis, and energy metabolism. Further, electrolytes like phosphate ions are crucial for the production of ATP. So you can see we have a variety of ways by which electrolytes, these ions, serve as functions in the body. As we move forward in lecture, we'll now consider the three most common ions, all of which we've considered in prior chapters: sodium, potassium, and calcium. We're going to begin with sodium, where sodium ions are the most abundant ions of the extracellular fluid, accounting for nearly 90% of our extracellular cations. And it not only plays a pivotal role in fluid balance, but it participates in the flow of ions through voltage-gated sodium channels in the plasma membranes of muscle fibers, remember the sarcolemma, and of nerve fibers, that neurolemma, which helps generate and conduct action potentials in neurons and in muscle fibers. Further, sodium levels in the blood are controlled primarily by three major hormones. We have aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, and atrial natriuretic peptide, or A&P. Let's go ahead and look at each of these three in more detail. Now, before we talk about aldosterone, recall from the last chapter, under conditions of normal glomerular filtration rate, or that GFR, roughly 65% of sodium in the filtrate is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubules, with another 30% reabsorbed along the nephron loop. However, conditions may result where these numbers are skewed. We don't have that ideal 65-30 reabsorption within the tubule system of the nephron. And with this in mind, we can consider the first hormonal control of sodium, that of aldosterone. Now remember back from our study of the endocrine system in chapter 16, aldosterone is produced by the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. And as we looked at last chapter, it's released in situations of low blood pressure, measured by the granular cells found in our afferent arterioles. And we might see it released under low sodium concentration of the filtrate, as measured by the juxtaglomerular cells of the distal convoluted tubules. And then renin, upon release by the granular cells found in those afferent arterioles, goes on to create angiotensin II with the help of our kidneys and our liver and our lungs. And so angiotensin II can go on to target various aspects of the body. And in particular for this topic, angiotensin II travels to the adrenal cortex, triggering the release of aldosterone, and thereafter, aldosterone goes on to encourage additional reabsorption of sodium at the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts of the kidneys, thereby indirectly encouraging the reabsorption of additional water. Because remember, water is going to follow sodium. So what's the outcome? In this case, we're going to see a very concentrated urine, an increase in blood volume, and a subsequent increase in blood pressure. Another mechanism, that of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, this is something we've considered already. In a somewhat indirect manner, the hypothalamus detects an increase in plasma osmolality, or concentration of solutes, including sodium, which causes the release of ADH by the posterior pituitary gland, where that ADH is going to act on principal cells of the collecting ducts, resulting in the reabsorption of water, which in turn results in the dilution of body fluids, including reducing sodium concentration in the blood. We also see an increase in blood volume, which goes on to increase blood pressure. The third mechanism of adjusting sodium concentration is with the help of atrial natriuretic peptide, a hormone released by mechanoreceptor cells found in the atria of the heart in response to atrial wall stretch caused by elevated blood pressure. And so in this situation, A&P or atrial natriuretic peptide is released by atrial myocytes of the heart. Now, A&P promotes a dilute urine and the loss of excess body fluids via urine by inhibiting the ability of the collecting ducts to reabsorb water. And this is done primarily through blocking the effects of ADH and ADH's traditional insertion of aquaporins at the collecting ducts. So atrial natriuretic peptide blocks that. Further, atrial natriuretic peptide suppresses the release of aldosterone, which goes on to target the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts, so we inhibit the reabsorption of sodium. Moving on from sodium, we can now go ahead and look at potassium. In contrast to sodium, which is found primarily in the extracellular fluid, we now consider potassium ions, our most abundant intracellular cation. And recall, potassium plays a key role in establishing a resting membrane potential and in the repolarization phase of action potentials in neurons and in muscle fibers, where it's found naturally inside a cell at a resting membrane state and only outside a cell within the interstitial space as we repolarize a cell before relying on sodium-potassium ATPase pumps to pump potassium back into a cell. Potassium is regulated with the help of renal mechanisms in the distal convoluted tubules, as well as in the collecting ducts, and we call this type of regulation potassium handling or potassium control. Now, as it pertains to the amount of potassium found in blood plasma, potassium is filtered freely at the glomerulus, where we find that roughly 65% is reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubules, with another 30% or so reabsorbed at the nephron loop. And this ultimately leads to too much potassium being reabsorbed by the body. As we pull 95% of the sodium we've pushed out and filtrate, as we pull that back into blood, our body says, that's too much. We need to actually get rid of some. So with this in mind, the primary regulation of potassium occurs at the distal convoluted tubules with the principal cells of the collecting ducts, where if we have too much potassium in blood plasma, we're going to secrete additional potassium into the filtrate by secreting aldosterone. And in contrast, under low plasma potassium levels, which is certainly very unusual, we reduce potassium secretion by suppressing aldosterone. We now turn to calcium, our third electrolyte. And calcium, as compared to sodium or potassium, is found stored primarily in the body, where it's sunk in our bones and our teeth, or maybe we find some in our muscle tissue. Think of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the terminal cisterns of our skeletal muscles, as well as we might find smaller concentrations in the blood plasma associated with our clotting proteins. And of course, we also have calcium involved with the release of neurotransmitter at the terminal axons in response to action potentials. So these are some areas by which we've seen calcium. The free calcium found in blood plasma, which filters out of the glomerulus to become part of the filtrate, is reabsorbed in the renal tubules with the help of parathyroid hormone. Recall, parathyroid hormone is released by the parathyroid glands found on the posterior aspect or the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. So let's go ahead and look to see how this works. Recall in our study of bones, as well as again during our second term of A&P in our study of the endocrine system, parathyroid hormone, secreted by the parathyroid gland, is released in response to declining levels of calcium in the blood. Recall earlier in the school year, we saw parathyroid hormone activate osteoclasts under these low calcium conditions, digesting bone, breaking it down, releasing calcium out into circulation. But how does parathyroid hormone act at the kidneys to conserve calcium? Well, first, much of the calcium filtered out of the glomerulus is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubules and at the nephron loop through no assistance of parathyroid hormone. However, parathyroid hormone is responsible for triggering the reabsorption of calcium at the distal convoluted tubules, ensuring the conservation of calcium elevating blood calcium levels. And in this manner, PTH, or parathyroid hormone, binds to receptors found on the cells of the distal convoluted tubules and stimulates the insertion of calcium channels, capturing calcium from filtrate, reabsorbing it, delivering it back to blood, where it can ultimately be sunk into bone or used for some kind of physiological process. From our discussion thus far this chapter, it's clear that ions play different roles in helping maintain body homeostasis. And one of the major homeostatic challenges we haven't yet discussed this chapter is in keeping our body within a narrow pH range. This task, maintaining acid-base balance, is critically important, and we're going to look at the bicarbonate buffering system as one of the major ways by which the body helps maintain homeostasis. You'll see in the chapter that there are other buffering systems involved. In this lecture, we're focused primarily on what we're going to call the bicarbonate buffering system. Now, as we look at a pH scale, most living cells, we're going to see pH close to 7, and even a slight change in pH can be harmful. If we look at our blood, normal blood pH of a healthy individual is somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45, just slightly to the right of neutral, slightly in an alkaline or a basic nature. Any drop below this narrow pH range is going to lead to our blood having too many hydrogen ions that the body needs to get rid of, a condition we call acidemia. Whereas any jump above this narrow pH range is going to result in our body not having enough hydrogen ions, a condition we call alkalemia. So how do we keep within a narrow pH range? Through a variety of buffering systems is the answer, but let's go ahead and look at the most important buffering system in the body, the bicarbonate buffering system. We're going to look at parts of the bicarbonate buffering equation. We're going to do this in a stepwise fashion. So we're going to pull little pieces of the equation and bring things together. This is part of the bicarbonate buffering system equation. We're going to see carbonic acid, or H2CO3, as a reactant. We're going to see it move in the right-hand direction to create products, which include this hydrogen ion here. So this is acid. And then we're going to see bicarbonate, which is a buffering substance. So what we have here, we have a weak acid, again, carbonic acid. And as it is put in solution, that is, it's put in the blood, we can donate a small number of hydrogen ions, leaving us with a weak base. And that's going to move the equation to the right. And because this is a weak base, bicarbonate ions can also accept hydrogen ions. So if we see this weak base accept hydrogen ions, we move this equation to the left, and we're going to reform carbonic acid. So how does this work in the body? Ultimately, if we don't have enough hydrogen ions, we're going to see carbonic acid break up into these protons and our bicarbonate. So this will increase the acidity or drop pH when we see this dissociation. In contrast, if we have too many hydrogen ions, then we're going to see that bicarbonate ion is going to sop up or pick up some of the hydrogen from the blood to reform, move in this direction, reform carbonic acid. So carbonic acid gives us a very simplistic buffering system that we call the bicarbonate buffering system. So I think at this point, everything makes sense, but I want to go ahead and add another part to the equation. We can add carbon dioxide and water because ultimately, if we break up carbonic acid, it may break up into carbon dioxide and water. So here at the left, if we combine carbon dioxide and water, we move to the right to get carbonic acid. This is a reversible reaction. We can take carbonic acid and we move it to the left and we make carbon dioxide and water, or we can take carbon dioxide and water, again, moving it to the right, make carbonic acid. Now, when we don't have enough hydrogen ions, when the pH in our body is too high, we are basic, that is, pH is going into a more alkaline state, we can actually create more hydrogen ions through this dissociation of carbonic acid into hydrogen ions and bicarb, which ultimately comes from the reaction back here of CO2 and H2O. So if we take carbon dioxide and water and combine it, we make carbonic acid, by which that is going to dissociate into solution and create hydrogen ions and bicarb. When we have too many hydrogen ions, we can send the equation to the left in reverse, creating more carbonic acid by joining bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. So we are going to create carbonic acid, which can then be sent back to the lungs, by which we can breathe out carbon dioxide and we can ultimately excrete water. Now, what you should start to understand is that respiration is a potential indicator of hydrogen ions in the body. If we want to get rid of hydrogen ions because the body is too acidic, we have too low of a pH, then we want to breathe off carbon dioxide. So we might want to increase respiration rate. And if we're too basic or too alkaline, if pH is greater than 7.45, then we might want to hold on to acid in the body. And we do that by slowing down our breathing, sending out less CO2. So if we send out less CO2, we're going to actually see carbon dioxide and water join together to create carbonic acid, which dissociates into more hydrogen ions and bicarb. And so in this manner, if we have a high pH and we want to make it lower, we are going to reduce our respiration rate, hold on to more carbon dioxide, which sends everything to the direction of the right. Now we can talk about acidosis and alkalosis. First, that of respiratory acidosis and alkalosis. Generally, acidosis is a scenario by which the blood is too acidic, so we have too many hydrogen ions in the blood, whereas alkalosis is a scenario by which the blood is too basic, and so we have too few hydrogen ions in the blood. Now, if we throw the term respiratory in there, we're simply talking about conditions in the lungs by which the blood becomes too acidic or too basic, specifically under the scenario of reduced rate of respiration, so less breaths per minute. We end up holding on to more carbon dioxide. Now remember, when we hold on to carbon dioxide, we're going to move everything to the right and we end up making more hydrogen ions. And so we're going to create more carbonic acid, which then dissociates into these hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. And because we have more hydrogen ions, we're going to see a drop in pH. The lungs are the cause of a drop in pH, or the lungs can be a cause in the drop of pH. Diseases by which we have a reduced rate of respiration, so we're thinking about just diseases generally with a reduced rate of respiration, might include emphysema, which is a disease whereby there's damage to the alveoli of the lungs, reducing surface area for gas exchange, which results in impaired ventilation and impaired CO2 removal. Asthma is another disease by which we have episodic airflow obstructions. Specifically, we have bronchoconstriction, which reduces ventilation and leads to a retention of carbon dioxide, which again causes respiratory acidosis. Finally, as it pertains to pneumonia or an infection of the lungs, whereby the alveolar sacs are going to fill with fluid and we're going to restrict the respiratory membrane, gas exchange is impaired, which leads to an increase in carbon dioxide levels of the blood. Now, although not listed here, there are certainly other things that might result in our respiratory acidosis. We might consider neuromuscular conditions that cause respiratory acidosis, such as with ALS and with muscular dystrophy, or nerves that control muscles associated with breathing become weakened. And that's going to lead to hypoventilation and the retention of carbon dioxide. Further, we might even think of sleep apnea as a potential cause of respiratory acidosis, because we might see the partial or complete obstruction of the airway during sleep results in a drop in gas exchange at the respiratory membrane, causing or resulting in higher CO2 levels and, again, respiratory acidosis. So to summarize, respiratory acidosis is caused by conditions that impair ventilation and reduce the ability to release CO2 from the lungs. In contrast to respiratory acidosis, we can also discuss respiratory alkalosis. This is a condition characterized by a decrease in carbon dioxide in the blood, leading to an increase in blood pH beyond 7.45. And this condition may result from things like hyperventilation or excessive breathing and the release of too much CO2. So we're thinking of CO2 being released at a rate faster than is being produced in the body. And things like anxiety and panic disorders, which lead to hyperventilation. So we have rapid and maybe even deep breathing as the body responds to stressors, which reduces carbon dioxide levels in the blood. And although we mentioned asthma earlier with respiratory acidosis, the early stages of an asthma attack with hyperventilation might initially lead to decreased levels of carbon dioxide. Also, we might see severe pain. In terms of pain might induce hyperventilation as part of the body's response, leading to decreased levels of CO2. And even high altitude, where there's a lower oxygen concentration level in the atmosphere, may cause hyperventilation as the body attempts to obtain more oxygen, leading to a reduction in carbon dioxide, causing respiratory alkalosis. In contrast to respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, which is caused due to lungs, we can also consider metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. Metabolic acidosis is a condition by which we see a drop in pH below our 7.35 due to an accumulation of acid or potentially due to a loss of bicarbonate in the kidneys. And this can be the result of some kind of acute kidney injury or some kind of chronic kidney condition where impaired kidney function leads to the reduced excretion of hydrogen ions or a decreased reabsorption of bicarbonate ions. Further, it might be as a result of increased acid production as a result of diabetic ketoacidosis or uncontrolled diabetes, where we see the breakdown of fat and the production of ketones resulting in a drop in pH. We're producing more acid in terms of diabetic ketoacidosis. Finally, it might be the result of severe diarrhea where we have a major loss of bicarbonate-rich intestinal fluids. Now, in contrast, metabolic alkalosis is a condition by which we see an increase in pH above 7.45 due to an accumulation of bicarbonate levels or a loss of hydrogen ions. Metabolic alkalosis can stem from the loss of acid from the gastrointestinal tract, such as with prolonged vomiting. The loss of hydrochloric acid from the stomach leads to a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration, which raises blood pH. And in contrast, the gain of bicarbonate ions in the body, such as by the overuse of antacids containing bicarbonate, might increase the risk of metabolic alkalosis. Further, the gain of bicarbonate could be the result of some kind of issue with bicarbonate reabsorption at the renal tubule. So maybe we are pulling in more bicarbonate than we need. And lastly, we could consider the oversecretion of hydrogen ions within the renal tubules, which also can be a cause of metabolic alkalosis. And so with that, we're actually going to conclude our study of Chapter 26, the study of fluids, of electrolytes, and acid-base balance. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me during office hours, and meanwhile, make it a great day.